Hey guys, we're back in the next chapters of The Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane, which I'm allowed to read for Scholastic because I have to say it every time, and it's getting a little annoying. But it's okay. We're allowed to read this book. I want you guys to make a prediction about what's going to happen in these next couple chapters. Okay, what's going to happen? The new little girl just got Edward, or I guess his name is Jangles now. So I want you to tell me, tell your partner, tell your mom, tell yourself, what's going to happen in these next chapters. What's the little girl going to do with him now? Go. Hey, I think she's gonna play with him. Thanks, BB-8. Yay. Okay. Of course, he just beeped. Beep, beep, beep. All right, here we go. Next chapter. Bryce and Sarah. Bryce and Sarah Ruth had a father. Early the next morning, when the light was gray and uncertain, Sarah Ruth was sitting up in bed, coughing. The father came home. He picked Edward up by the ears and said, "I ain't never." "It's a baby doll," said Bryce. "Don't look like a baby doll to me." Edward, hanging by one ear, was frightened. This, he was certain, was the man who crushed the heads of China dolls. "Jangles," said Ruth between coughs. She held out her arms. "He's hers. He belongs to her." The father dropped Edward on the bed, and Bryce picked up the rabbit and handed him to Sarah Ruth. "It don't matter anyway. It don't make no difference. None of it." "It does matter," said Bryce. "Don't you sass me," said the father, and he raised his hand and slapped Bryce across the mouth, and he turned and left the house. "You ain't got to worry about him," said Bryce. "He ain't nothing but a bully, and besides, he don't hardly ever come home." Fortunately, the father did come back that day, and Bryce went out to work, and Sarah Ruth spent the day in bed, holding Edward in her lap. "Pretty," she said to Edward as she lined up the buttons. Sometimes when coughing fit was particularly bad, she squeezed Edward so tight, and he was afraid he would crack in two. Also, in between coughing fits, she took to sucking on one of Edward's ears. Normally, Edward would have found this intrusive, clingy behavior, but there was something about Sarah Ruth. He wanted to care for her. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to do more for her. At the end of the day, Bryce returned with a biscuit for Sarah Ruth. Sarah Ruth held the biscuit in both hands and took small, tentative bites. You eat all that up, honey. Let me hold Jangles," said Bryce. "Him and me got a surprise for you." Bryce took Edward off into a corner of the room with his pocket knife, and he cut out the lengths of twine and tied them to Edward's arms and feet, and tied the twine into sticks of wood. "See, the day I've been thinking about it. All day I've been thinking about it. And what we're going to do is make you dance." Sarah Ruth loves dancing. Mama used to hold on her and dance her around the room. "You eating that biscuit?" Bryce called out to Sarah. "Uh-huh." "You hold on, honey. We got a surprise for you." And Bryce stood up. "Close your eyes." "Okay, open them now." And Sarah Ruth opened her eyes. "Dance, Jangles." And then moving the strings with sticks with one hand, Bryce made Edward dance and drop away. And in the whole while, at the same time, with his other hand, he held up to his harmonica and played a bright, lively tune. Sarah Ruth laughed. She laughed until she started to cough. "You want some fresh air?" he asked her. "Let's get you out of this nasty old air." And Bryce carried his sister outside. He left Edward on the bed, staring up at the smoke-stained ceiling. He thought again about having wings. If he had them, he thought, he would just fly above the world. Surely, so high above the world, she would be... He would fly above the world to where the air was clear and would take Sarah Ruth with him. Surely, so high above the world, she would be able to breathe. After a minute, Bryce came back inside, still carrying Sarah. "She wants you, too." "Jangles," said Sarah Ruth, and she held out her arms. So Bryce held Sarah Ruth, and Sarah Ruth held Edward, and the three of them stood outside. Bryce said, You got to look for falling stars. They're the ones with magic." They were quiet for a long time, all three of them. Sarah Ruth stopped coughing. "There," she said, and she pointed to a star streaking across the night sky. "Make a wish, honey," Bryce said. "That's your star. You make a wish for anything you want." And even though it was Sarah Ruth's star, Edward wished for something too. All right, next one is chapter 19. We're just going to keep going, guys. That's okay with you. We're on a roll. We're going to keep going because I'm excited to finish. The days passed. The sun rose and set, and rose again and set again. Sometimes the father would come home, and sometimes he did not. Edward's ears became soggy, and he did not care. His sweater had almost completely unraveled, and it didn't bother him. He was hugged half to death, and it felt good. In the evenings, at the hands of Bryce and at the ends of the twine, Edward would dance and dance. 1 month passed, and then 2, and then 3. Sarah Ruth got worse. In the 5th month, she refused to eat at all. And in the 6th month, she began to cough up blood. Her breathing became ragged and uncertain, as if she was trying to remember in between breaths what to do. "Breathe, honey," Bryce said, and he stood over her. "Breathe," thought Edward from deep inside the well of her arms. "Please breathe." Bryce stopped leaving the house. He sat at home all day and held Ruth in his lap and rocked her back and forth and sang to her. And on a bright morning in September, Sarah Ruth stopped breathing. "Oh no," said Bryce. "Oh honey, take a little breath, please." Edward had fallen out of Sarah Ruth's arms the night before. She had not asked for him again. So face down on the floor, arms above his head, Edward listened to Bryce weep. He listened as his father came home and shouted at Bryce. He listened as the father wept. "You can't cry," Bryce shouted. "You got no right to cry. You never even loved her. You don't even know nothing about love." "I loved her," said the father. "I loved her." "I loved her too," thought Edward. "I loved her. Now she's gone. How could this be? How could he bear to live in a world without Sarah?" The yelling between the father and the son continues, and there was a terrible moment when the father insisted that Sarah belonged to him, and she was his girl, his baby, and he was taking her. "She ain't yours," Bryce screamed. You can't take her. She ain't yours." But the father was bigger and stronger, and he prevailed. He wrapped Sarah in a blanket and carried her away. The small house became very quiet, and Edward could hear Bryce moving around, muttering to himself. And then finally the boy picked Edward up. "Come on, Jangles. We're leaving. We're going to Memphis." Alright, and there's the picture of Jangles. Alright. Now, I know it's getting a little sad, guys, okay? So bear with me here, okay? I know the story is a bit sad, okay? But there's also real life stuff that happens here, all right? So I'll start you guys off with an easy one, okay? What has happened to Sarah? Okay, give me, what was wrong with her is the most part. It never actually says it, but you can probably figure it out, all right? So what was wrong with Sarah, okay? And then going back in the feelings, your second question is, I want to know, how has Bryce's feelings changed? What does Bryce feel? All right, so we have Bryce's feelings changed a little bit. He's doing something. Tell me how his feelings changed. You guys do that for me? So feelings, and tell me a little about Sarah. Hope you guys have a great first these days back. We'll get right into it, and I'll see you guys next time for the next chapters.